Hello, welcome to On Wildlife. I'm your host, Alex Ray. On this podcast, we bring the wild to you. We take you on a journey into the life of a different animal every week, and I guarantee you're going to come out of here knowing more about your favorite animal than you did before. This week, we're heading to the freshwater areas of Australia to talk about one of the strangest animals on the planet. And joining me today is Dr. Geoff Williams, who has dedicated his life to studying and saving the animal that we're talking about today. So get ready to head underwater to explore one of the only mammals that can lay eggs, platypuses. The platypus's name comes from two Greek words, platus, which means flat, and pous, which means foot. And you'll see that their feet are kind of flat, which isn't great for walking on land, but it really helps them when they swim through the water. Platypuses are only naturally found in the freshwater ecosystems of eastern Australia. And they have so many cool adaptations for being in the water, and you'll hear all about that later on in the episode. These animals grow to be around 20 inches long and weigh only about 3 pounds. And unfortunately, their populations are declining. They're listed as near threatened on the IUCN Red List. But luckily, our guest, Dr. Geoff Williams, is doing a lot of work to support their conservation. He's also the director of the Australian Platypus Conservancy. But why did he start working with platypuses?
Yeah, look, almost everybody who works with platypus says the same thing, that they didn't choose platypus, the platypus chooses them. And I think that was true in my case. Look, initially I was the assistant director at Taronga Zoo, which is the biggest zoo in Australia in Sydney. And I had a bit of a connection, an indirect one with platypus there. But then in the late 1980s, I moved to be director of Hillsville Sanctuary. Now, Hillsville Sanctuary is about an hour east of Melbourne, the big city in the southeast part of Australia. And it's Australia's main zoo for native species. So it only has Australian animals. And it's always had a long association with platypus. It was the first place where the platypus was kept successfully in a zoo in the 1930s. It was the first place they were bred in captivity in the 1940s. And there was a time when if you said platypus to anybody in Australia, they automatically thought Hillsville. And so when I went there in the 1980s, though, things were a bit grim. They hadn't bred the platypus since that one and only occasion in the 1940s. They had an exhibit that had been built ready for the 1956 Melbourne Olympics, and by then it was really showing its age and it was very unsatisfactory. And so one of my first priorities as director was to try and get the platypus back into focus. And one of the things I did was to set in train plans for a new facility that would enable us to get captive breeding going. And the other thing I did was, Hillsville actually has a little creek that runs through it that has a natural platypus population. And so one of the things as part of that overall planning for what we were doing was to get research going with platypus in the wild in that river. And we were lucky that we had an association with the Brookfield Zoo in Chicago. They found a very good American biologist for us, Dr. Melody Serena, who'd already worked in Australia doing radio tracking with a beautiful little marsupial carnivore called the Western Quoll. She had experience, therefore, with tracking Australian animals. She developed a program to track the platypus for the first time ever. And the result was all that work we were doing got a lot of media coverage, front page of the main newspaper in Melbourne and so on. And what then happened was interesting because people from all over Eastern Australia, where the platypus occurred, started contacting us and saying, look, we used to have platypus in our creek, but we're not seeing them as much now. And it really started ringing a few alarm bells because when we thought about it, it was becoming obvious by that time that a lot of Australia's rivers were in a very poor condition. In the 200 years of European settlement, we'd made a bit of a mess of our environment. And therefore, it was I guess a sort of bit of a no-brainer. But if we've messed up our rivers, we've probably made things difficult for platypus. But they were being ignored. The government agencies just said, the platypus, it's a common species, we don't have to worry about it. But yet it was clear that that wasn't true. And so that's how the Australian Platypus Conservancy got started. The team I had at Hillsville, we started working more and more with species, with the platypus in the wild. That really didn't fit into the zoo sort of, basket. And so we set up a separate organisation that was dedicated to platypus. So that's how I got involved with platypus. And the reason I say they chose me was the very first night I was at Hillsville, I was walking around the sanctuary with my kids after the public had all gone. And there by the side of the little creek was a platypus sitting there just looking at me. And that was the first time I'd ever seen a platypus close up. And it was like saying, hey, Geoff, you've arrived now, going, you've got to look after us. And that was the sort of how I got taken over by the platypus, yeah.
So it was really just a sign for Geoff that he was in the right business. Now let's hear a little bit more about the Australian Platypus Conservancy.
Yeah, sure. Look, when the Conservancy was first set up, our first priority was to find out about the platypus's immediate conservation needs, because the platypus, everybody just said, look, we don't have to worry about it, it's common, but it clearly wasn't. But very little was known about the species, even though it's such an important species in a scientific sense, and we'll talk about that later. But it's a hard species to study, and so consequently not many people have ever bothered finding out about the platypus, and particularly about its ecological sort of needs. And so that was the first emphasis. We did a lot of survey work in areas where we knew the platypus was sort of living on the edge. So in other words, in areas where urban areas where the habitat had been changed by human development, and in agricultural areas where there'd been major changes to our rivers because of that. And so we looked at how the platypus were doing, and we tried to identify what were the key factors that made life good for a platypus or were causing problems. And from that, we were then able to start, identifying the key issues and work with management agents. So it is fabulous work, but it's really, really hard. It involves a lot of 24 hours non-stop work, because basically you set your survey nets in the afternoon, you work right through the night because the platypus is mainly active at night, and then you pack up and go home, and the whole thing is, but you find out a lot about the platypus in doing so. So terrific work. We did a lot of that, and a lot of radio tracking studies where we try to find out what the platypus home range was, where their preferred foraging areas were, and all those sorts of things nobody really knew. So we did a lot of that work. As time has gone on, we've sort of evolved. I think we found out now in the first sort of 10 years of work or 15 years of work, we identified most of the key issues that we think are important for platypus conservation. So in the last few years, our work has now switched much more to working with the various management agencies, the wildlife agencies and the land management agencies in Australia, to ensure that they take platypus conservation on board as one of the things that we do. And we now spend a lot of time providing technical advice to them. And now we also do a lot of work to get people involved in monitoring platypus in their local community and how they can go about helping the platypus. So we have citizen science programs where people count platypus numbers and all of those sorts of things. So that's really where our work has sort of evolved to now. We still do some hands-on live trapping work, but not perhaps as much as we used to now, because it really is as necessary as it was.
That sounds like really intense but very important work. Now, platypuses are one of the most unique animals on Earth. What kind of animals are they related to?
Okay, the platypus's main sort of distinct feature is that it's a mammal, but it reproduces by laying eggs. Now, the eggs themselves are not hard like a bird's egg. They're actually quite soft and leathery. They're very similar to the eggs of snakes and lizards. So it's a sort of reptilian. And the theory is that the platypus sits at the very earliest evolutionary line of reptiles evolving to become mammals. And so the platypus can trace its ancestry back to, we think, about 120, 140 million years ago when that process was happening. So they were the first try, as it were, the first version of mammals. And the only other species that comes close to the platypus is what's called the echidna, which is, for people who don't know it, the echidna is basically it's a bit like a small porcupine or a large hedgehog in a Eurasian sense. In other words, it's covered in spines, and it's an anteater. And there's one species of it that occurs in Australia. And in addition, that species also occurs in New Guinea, the big island to the north of Australia, where there are probably several other species of echidnas there, but they're not very well known. So that group, the platypus and the echidnas, are what are known as monotremes. Now, monotreme is a word that means one whole, and what that refers to is the fact that the platypus and the echidna have what's called a cloaca, which is what a reptile and a bird has. In other words, only one hole for all its reproductive and its urinary features. So it's in that sort of class of animals, you know. So as a platypus and echidnas are the most closely linked. And interestingly, platypus and echidnas are probably most linked to lizards more than other mammals. They have the platypus has many reptilian features, and we'll again talk about some of those later, including the fact that they're venomous. And so they have, for example, just to give one example of their reptilian features, they have the same sort of shoulder structure as a lizard. So if your shoulder structure is actually great for swimming, you know, they've got really powerful swimming motion and also powerful for digging, as both platypus and the echidnas dig. So that's its sort of background. So it's a real weird one, being an egg-laying mammal.
It's pretty crazy that platypuses may be the mammal that's most closely related to reptiles. But what's the benefit of laying eggs instead of giving birth to live young?
The advantage of being an egg-laying animal is that you invest your care in looking after the egg and the hatchling for a while, but the young becomes independent fairly quickly. So in the case of a platypus, basically in Australia, they incubate the eggs in about October, November, and that takes about 10 to 11 days to actually hatch the egg. They actually then look after the baby in a nest, and the nest is that they pick up materials with their tail and carry into a burrow, and they build a nest in a burrow, and they will feed the babies in the nest with a very rich milk for the best part of 3 months. And so they come out in about late January, February. And then after that, basically, the adults don't invest much time in. The mother perhaps spends a few more days, and then the young go off and have to fend.
So platypuses spend around 3 months taking care of their kids, while humans spend around 18 years doing the same. And like Geoff said earlier, platypuses are venomous.
It's only the males that have the venom, and they have a spur, a little spike, on each of their hind ankles, and that's about 1.5 centimetres, so about just over half an inch long, and that's where the venom is expelled from. Now, look, the venom itself, people often ask us, will it kill you and all this sort of stuff? No, it won't. There's no evidence that it's that powerful, but it will. There are possibilities that it is powerful enough to have killed dogs and so on in the past. If you do get spurred by a platypus, it will be incredibly painful. I mean, we used to milk venom and send it to the Australian National University for chemical analysis, and they found 4 pain causes that were previously unknown to medical science. And people who have been spurred by it say it is excruciating, and things like some of the standard painkillers like morphine don't work on it at all. So it's not the sort of thing you want to have happen to you. Having said that, look, platypus are not dangerous animals. Australia has a bit of a reputation for having all these really dangerous snakes and things and whatever, sharks and gunnequills and crocodiles, but we're actually a fairly safe country, really. And platypus fall into that category. Although they can hurt you, they're not going to unless you absolutely have an accident with one of them by picking it up when you shouldn't pick up one. So the venom itself is what it's really there for, is part of the process of the male platypus fighting with each other during the breeding season. At the beginning of the breeding season, which in Australia is round about sort of the end of our winter, so around August, September, the males fight quite hard. They rip into each other with these spurs, and there's some quite good footage on YouTube of that happening. And when we handle them during that time of the year, they often have rips out of each other where they put the spurs in. We think what happens with the venom when they use it during fighting, what I said earlier, it causes pain, and we think it's just part of that process, that if you can inflict that sort of pain on your person, the animal you're fighting with, it just helps you win the battle that much more easily.
Now you know that you shouldn't go around trying to pick one of these guys up, or you'll be in a lot of pain. Another unique feature that platypuses have is their bill that kind of looks like a duck's bill. You'll hear more about that right after the break. The science word that I want to talk about today is morphology. Morphology is really just a fancy way of saying the physical characteristics of an organism, but we can use morphology to determine the relatedness of different organisms as well as what their ancestors may have looked like. Welcome back. So I asked Geoff what a platypus's bill is used for.
Okay, yeah, now platypus are often called duckbills or whatever. Look, the bill does look a bit like a duck's bill, but in fact it's actually not hard like a duck's bill at all. It's actually quite soft and bendy, and it's not solid. It consists of sort of two bones that protrude out, and that's all then covered in skin and gristle. So it feels, if you touch it, it feels like sort of good quality leather, and as I said, it's not quite soft. It's both a mouth and a nose. The nostrils are on the top so that you can breathe easily when it pops to the surface. The mouth is quite interesting in that it doesn't have teeth. The platypus just has grinding pads, and that really reflects what the platypuses are mainly eating are bugs that live in the water. So things up to about the size of freshwater crayfish. And having grinding pads is much more efficient, really mashing up those small things and getting all the food out of them. So that's why they have grinding pads instead of teeth. But what's really important about the bill is it's where the platypus has a genuine sixth sense. Now, when the platypus dives underwater, its eyes and its ears, which are in a sort of groove behind the eye, they snap shut so the water doesn't get in the eyes and doesn't get in the ears. And so it loses two of its five senses. And so what it's got to compensate is this special sixth sense. That's a scanning system. And what it scans for is tiny, tiny flickers of electricity that are generated by the bugs that it's hunting. It sounds ridiculous, but if you take a freshwater crayfish, when they move, they generate a tiny amount of electricity, about a millionth of what we can comprehend. And yet the platypus scanning system can home in on that, and that's how they hunt. The bill also, in addition to that scanning system, has a lot of pressure sensors on it as well. And so we think the whole package helps the platypus sort of navigate underwater as well with its eyes closed. So it's a really sophisticated system. A very high percentage of the platypus brain is given over to processing all that information that's coming in through the bill. And there's really nothing quite like it in the animal world. I used to be able to say that confidently. They've now found a species of river dolphin in South America that has something a bit similar, but it's really, 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 really special.
A platypus's bill is just one example of how uniquely adapted to their environment they are. It's really amazing. Another example is their fur.
They have two layers of fur that are very close to the body, sort of dense fur, and then longer what we call guard fur. And so that two layers create an air all around the body. So this layer of air serves as an insulating, so they can stay in cold water conditions for hours and hours and hours without getting hypothermic. And as also part of that process is how dense the hair is. I mean, somebody once counted how many hairs on a square millimetre. That's about the size of a full stop on a printed page. And it was something like 600 to 900 fibres. Now, that's denser than a polar bear. I mean, the only thing that's denser than that is a sea otter, which, of course, basically never comes out of the water. And again, another sort of adaptation I just love is their front feet. If you look at their front feet, they've got this amazing web of skin that comes out. So it's very stretchy. It's a bit like the wing of a fruit bat. And therefore, it makes these amazing paddles that they can swim with. They just propel themselves with their front feet, and they can really swim quite fast when they need to. But the interesting thing about the feet is that when they want to, they can just basically fold that big web of skin back inside their palm, and then they've got these really big blunt claws, which are good for digging. So this is an animal that not only has evolved to be terrific in the water, it's also terrific at living underground. It dig burrows. It can dig about a metre of tunnel in about an hour when it really wants to. So it can dig and then produce these cosy little burrows that it lives in and can raise its young in. So it's got all these adaptations. So it's a really well-adapted animal. And I always say to people, it wouldn't have been around for 120, 140 million years if it wasn't really good at what it does.
No wonder they've been able to survive on Earth for so long, with all of their weird but important traits. Now, I asked Geoff why platypuses are important to the ecosystems that they live in.
Okay, well, one of the things is that they're basically, in Australia, they're effectively the top predator in the aquatic food chain. I mean, in terms of the sense that they feed on mainly bugs, they will eat small fish and they will eat other things. But because they feed on the aquatic invertebrate fauna, they are the top of that particular food chain in our systems. And given that we don't have much other aquatic mammals apart from the Australian water rat or ricale, the platypus, therefore, is the top of the feeding chain, and therefore is generally accepted. An apex predator in that sense is one of the key factors in keeping systems healthy. By its process of predation upon all those bugs, it makes certain that you keep your system in balance, and that's always a good thing. It's typically when you lose your top predators in systems, that's when they start breaking down and you get things going wrong in terms of imbalances between the natural species makeup. So that's its real key importance. Yeah.
So they're really important, but they're facing a lot of problems right now.
Europeans arrived in Australia about 230 odd years ago when Britain took over Australia. And the impact of European settlement has been immense on our environment. I mean, obviously, huge changes were made, both deliberately to, clear land for agriculture or just accidentally through the sort of things we did without knowing what the impact was. And that's been particularly true of our aquatic environments. Our river systems have been hugely modified by the building of dams and by extraction of huge amounts of water for irrigation purposes and water supply purposes for cities and so on. We've cleared a lot of our native vegetation along our riverbanks to make them easier to farm for various reasons. Of course, that then has led to all sorts of problems of erosion of the riverbanks, and then huge amounts of sediment have built up in some of our rivers and so on. So all of those factors, by degrading the quality of the habitat, have made life tough for platypus, because all of those sort of things had either a direct impact. I mean, if you have a lot of erosion going along the banks, then it makes it really difficult for platypus to put their burrows there, obviously. And likewise, if you've got lots of sediment going in the water, that makes it less good for those bugs the platypus live on. And so if there's less food around, there's going to be less platypus. And if you change the flows of our rivers, water is everything to a platypus. And so consequently, if you start changing the flows so that you have periods when there's very low flows, it makes life hard, particularly if that coincides with a period when those youngsters come out and they're trying to find their way in the world. It makes them very prone to getting into problems. And then, of course, in addition to the environmental changes, we've made all sorts of other impacts upon ecosystems by introducing species from outside Australia. And the most classic example of that in Australia is the fox. Typically, the platypus did not have many natural predators. Possibly in the past, various types of our birds of prey took platypus, but probably not in enough numbers to make an impact on populations. But once you brought foxes in, they made a huge dent in our native wildlife here in Australia, because most of Australian animals were fairly naive in terms of not having to cope with many carnivorous predators. And so suddenly you had foxes everywhere, and these naive animals just got chomped up, and that was certainly the case with the platypus. And it's interesting now that there is a big difference between the behaviour of platypus on mainland Australia and the platypus on our island state of Tasmania, which never had foxes. And there is a real difference in their behaviour. You know, the platypus on the mainland now are relatively shy, well, relatively wary, let's put it that way. You know, they've evolved to know that if they're not careful, a fox is going to chomp on them. On Tasmania, the platypus there are still remarkably confiding. You know, you can walk up to a platypus and stand within a couple of metres of it and they won't be bothered because they haven't had that evolutionary pressure to adapt. And so fox predation, particularly on the young platypus when they first come out, these are really naive, silly animals. They tend to be in the shallow areas. Foxes come down and chomp them. So they're the sort of changes. And of course, other things, we brought in all sorts of introduced fish species like carp, and they do huge damage to our waterways, compete with platypus by eating the bugs the platypus eat. So we've done a lot of things wrong, and that's what we're now working with. The various agencies in Australia are putting in huge efforts to try and turn things around, but we've got a long way to go to try to get things back.
Some of the things that Geoff mentioned are ideas that we don't really think about, but bringing an organism into a new environment can cause some serious damage.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the questions we often get is why don't we move platypus to the parts of Australia where they don't occur? So, for example, platypus basically occur down the eastern side of Australia. And so, you know, there is plenty of suitable habitat in Western Australia. And people say to us, well, you know, why don't you just chuck a lot of platypus over there? And the answer would be, well, you know, we really don't want to cause problems for some of the species that have evolved separately in Western Australia. I mean, if you look at the sort of the bugs that platypus would go over there and eat, they are unique species. They are not the sort of things that have coped with predation by platypus. And if you suddenly stuck platypus in there to become top predators in a system that wasn't used to having top predators, it would make huge differences. And we really have to be careful about how we do these things.
So what are some of the ways that we can help platypuses?
The platypus has this reputation for being not only such a very special animal, but people think it's a very sort of rare animal that's so special it can't occur near to people. And this is a myth that the average Australian would believe. If you said to the average person in the street in, say, Melbourne or Sydney, and you said to them, you know, where does platypus, where would you find a platypus? They'd say, oh, you know, well, it's hundreds of miles from here. It's way up in the you know, headwaters of the rivers where there's pristine habitat, things like that. And that's the problem we actually face in trying to get the conservation message across, because platypus actually don't live way off in the pristine areas. They live, you know, can live close to people. In Melbourne, a big city, you know, 4 or 5 million people. I mean, the platypus actually occurs within about 15 kilometres of the city centre, and they live, you know, can live really close to people. Not necessarily in such high numbers as they would in pristine areas, but the point I'm making is that they're not excluded by good conditions if you can work with them. And that's the message we always try to get across to people, that people's actions make a difference, particularly some of the things they should be avoiding doing. A lot of platypus, for example, get litter items around them of various descriptions because people are not careful with, you know, how they dispose of litter. They drop things in the street that then gets washed down the stormwater drains, ends up in our rivers, ends up around platypus. And some of the platypus we found in urban areas around Melbourne, something like 30% of the population have litter around them at some times in their lives. Not necessarily always going to kill them. You know, it can be rubber bands and things like that are fairly innocuous. But some of the things like plastic rings and even like elasticated hair ties, the people that tie their ponytails up with, if that gets around the platypus and constricts its movement, it causes, you know, death and injury. So it's things like that people should be doing. Again, a lot of people just don't realise that when they're fishing, they can cause problems for platypus. You know, I mean, amazingly, quite a large number of platypus get hooked on their fishing lines, and people don't know what to do. They cut the line, and the platypus swims off, and then the trailing line gets tangled, and the platypus gets killed themselves. So there's simple things people can avoid doing. But the more important thing in Australia is we say to people, look, you can actually make a big difference to platypus by simply improving your work along the rivers and creeks, plant more trees along your rivers and creeks. But the big thing is consider also your lifestyle changes, because at the end of the day, the platypus needs water. And the big problem we face in Australia is we as a species are using vast amounts of our natural water resources. And at the rate we're going, Australia's population growth is going to outstrip its water resources if we are not careful. And so we say to people, look, it's time you started thinking about how you use water more productively in terms of recycling water in urban areas, using less water for various functions and so on, so that we can leave more water in our rivers for the platypus and all the other species that depend on it.
There are so many simple things that we can be doing that make a huge difference. I'm so glad that Geoff was able to come on to the podcast. I got to learn so many cool things about platypuses and how we can help them. If you care about platypuses, you should check out the Australian Platypus Conservancy, Bush Heritage Australia, and the Victorian Environmental Water Holder. Thank you so much for coming on this adventure with me as we explored the world of platypuses. You can find the sources that we used for this podcast and links to organizations that we reference at onwildlife.org. You can also email us with any questions at onwildlife.podcast@gmail.com. And you can follow us on Instagram at @on_wildlife and on TikTok @onwildlife. Don't forget to tune in next Wednesday for another awesome episode. And that's On Wildlife.
You've been listening to On Wildlife with Alex Ray. On Wildlife provides general educational information on various topics as a public service, which should not be construed as professional, financial, real estate, tax, or legal advice. These are our personal opinions only. Please refer to our full disclaimer policy on our website for full details.